It's great to have a big business. It's great to influence your community. Those are important, but the heart can easily grasp onto those things as ultimate, or I need those to be okay. But the finished work of Christ means I am complete. I have all the riches and the notoriety I need right now because I am God's son.
Well, hello everyone. Tommy Lee here with another episode of Up Next. Today I get a chance to talk with a new friend, Jeff Haanen. And Jeff, I have heard about you. I've heard about the Denver Institute of Faith and Work, all of that, and it is an honor to talk with you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tommy.
Yeah. Now, where's home specifically in Colorado? Where are you living in Colorado?
Yep, so I'm just south of Denver. Live with my wife and my 4 daughters, all girls. So I'm in full-time women's ministry with my girls at my house in Littleton, which is a southern suburb of Denver.
Yes. And so now, are your girls, are they younger or now are they like in college, grown up now?
They're not as young as they used to be. So they are 9, 11, 14, and 16. And my oldest just started driving a car, actually. So we're in a new world.
Got it. I have 2 daughters, Jeff. I have a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old. What have you learned about working with daughters as they get older that I need to learn, Jeff?
Well, I'm just learning that. It's interesting that you say that because as my girls become teenagers now, the parenting season has shifted. And I think younger kids needed to be cared for and loved, and they sort of needed right and wrong direction. That doesn't work as well with my teenage daughters. I'm now in a shift to more of a coaching mode with my teenage daughters. So still need to be loved, still need to be cared for, but they need the right question asked and not the right sort of do this, don't do that. So I am trying to grow in my own parenting in terms of listening well and asking the right questions for them to do their own values formation and faith formation in their season of life.
Yeah. Jeff, as a parent, and we'll talk about your job and your book and all that stuff, how do you get your daughters to come and sit down and ask you questions? Or do you find that you have to go and sit down and ask them questions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually think it's more the latter. Being curious about their life, about their days, about their schools, about their friends, about what they're listening to on their iPhones, what they're watching. I think it's just that attention and curiosity. My wife and I have said this a lot. This season of life, we really need to have the bandwidth in our own emotional and spiritual health so that we can give that to our daughters and be just very present to them.
Yeah.
So I think that they're not going to, sometimes they'll ask me questions, but not as much as they used to. And so now it's me just being genuinely curious about their lives that creates that context for friendship. And I would also say too, that as they're becoming young women, that sort of affirmation from dad really fills their bucket. Like really fills their bucket. They need that in a very unique way. And I want to keep on giving that to them.
Wow. Thank you. Hey, as my girls get older, don't be surprised if I pick your brain on how to raise up young girls.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. Hey, you are the founder of Denver Institute for Faith and Work. When did you start that, and how did it go about starting?
Yeah. So that was back in 2012, which is a ways back now. What is that? 12 years ago.
Yes.
So I started this really in my late 20s, early 30s. I'm now in my 40s with a vision probably very similar to what you had. Our city has a big divide between churches and church life and then how the rest of the city functions, right? And those functions of a city are very much just people working in various different industries. So back in 2012, I was like, I see this gap. I've been influenced by a handful of authors and said this gap ought to be closed. It comes from this, vision of Christ, Lord of all of life, in my own Reformed tradition, and I saw that wasn't being done in my own city. So it's it was a bit of a journey. Starting an organization, you put together a plan, you see if you can get a few board members, you start meeting, you put together a first event, and our first event was the fall of 2013. We put together a event on faith and technology in one of the most secular cities in the United States, which is Boulder, Colorado. And it was great. We listened. We got to know some tech leaders. We had a gentleman by the name of John Dyer, who has written on faith and technology at Dallas, DTS. He shared, and that sort of began a journey of building an organization that we wanted to sit in this gap between, churches and city, or faith and work.
Yeah. Jeff, before all of this, what were you doing in your job?
So I did seminary, and then for the 3-4 years after that, I worked at a Christian school. And before that, I was a pastor of a Latino church. So I was a
Okay.
missionary in Latin America. My wife and I speak Spanish. And so I was an associate pastor. One of my first jobs after seminary a long time ago was as associate pastor of Iglesia Bautista Nueva Esperanza, New Hope Baptist Church in Brighton, Colorado. So
Wonderful.
it was
Wonderful.
ministry world of a sort. I've always been in that.
Jeff, on my end, I graduated from Washington University in St. Louis, and I thought I was going to be a chemistry major, going to be a doctor. After first year, I went to the business school, built cell towers for about 10 years. And then from that point on, went to Moody Seminary at night, tried working as a pastor for 3 years, worked at Moody Bible Institute in the president's office for a number of years. And then there was something that was always bothering me. There was just something about the divide between those being in ministry and for me, someone who worked full time in the business world. What does it mean? Am I ultimately called to go in the full time pastoral ministry? But what if I don't want to do it? What does that look like? And so it made me search. And in 2012, I also started Resource Global as well, too, similar to you. And I was probably in my late 20s, and now here I am in my 40s.
Yeah, very similar journey, sounds like, for us.
Yeah. Jeff, in the early days, I mean, how has the faith and work conversation changed now compared to when you first started in 2012?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when it started in 2012, that was really a heyday in terms of interest broadly within evangelicals. Praxis was just getting cooking. At that time, Tim Keller had written on it. The Center for Faith and Work was doing some really interesting stuff. And I think at that time, evangelicals were asking questions, as they still are, but what does it look like to engage culture? And this was a way, particularly for college-educated evangelicals, and say, this is a way we can not just engage it, but to Andy Crouch's point, we can actually create it and shape culture. And so I really think that was a heyday. I think there was a lot in the air. There was a lot of things growing. And I think it's now shifted a bit, in my view, in the last at least 5-ish years. I think because of, at least in the United States, it's become more and more wrought and difficult to think about Christians and culture, especially because of how difficult and contentious our political life is.
Yeah.
And so not only because of that, but I think there's a handful of other movements whereby it has made a little bit of a shift. Particularly, it's maybe less around how we're going to shape culture that feels less attainable today. At least maybe this is my own season of life speaking too, but I think it has a lot more to do with actually the title of my book, Working from the Inside Out, or who we become in the process. What does it look like for us to be faithful inside these situations that we find ourselves, whether they're positions of high power or almost no power? So I think it's shifted a little bit more from a cultural renewal conversation, in my view, to a little bit more of a formation conversation. I will say, though, that I have a biased view on that. That is, I think, an area that I think is a good shift overall. And not everybody would agree with me.
Yeah, yeah. Now, even with the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, for what you're doing, are you dealing more with older leaders who are retired or are senior leaders, or you're dealing with more younger leaders? And if so, do you see a difference in their thinking in terms of faith and work?
Yeah, I do. So with older leaders, I see, and maybe not only Denver Institute, but broadly, I would say within evangelicalism in the United States, older tends to think about activism, which is good, but activism in terms of evangelism and impact. I think those are the things I tend to see, even in some more legacy-minded faith and work organizations. It's like, how can I steward my impact? Those kinds of conversations. And I think those are still happening among younger generations. But because of a younger generation, Gen Z, and even some millennials as well, there's just a lot of uncertainty, issues around everything from identity to anxiety. I actually think it's principally a formation question. So questions around calling are much more about Christian formation, I think, for younger folks. And they're a little, we had a fellowship program going for years. It's not that they were uninterested in making an impact in their city, but they were very interested in questions of how do I deal with my anxiety, or who am I becoming, or those types of things.
Got
So I
it.
do think there's a little bit of a difference between generations of sort of impact, which still is happening today, but I almost see with younger, almost like I wrote about this in my book. There's a New York Times article right during COVID called The Age of Anti-Ambition. And I actually see almost that with the younger generation. Almost
Yeah,
work needs to fit in its place, and I'm almost anti-ambitious in finding my identity much outside of work compared to boomers and others that found most of it inside their work.
very good. How do you see it evolving? Where do you see it going as the conversation continues to develop?
Yeah, I can only speak of my own context really here in Colorado and maybe in the United States. I think the conversation still needs to grow in terms of it's being rooted in the local church. I would like to see that. I do think that areas of Christian formation are important, and I would like to see more people talking about blue collar or frontline employees and what the faith and work movement can mean for them, and not
Yeah,
only sort
yeah,
of entrepreneurs and business leaders. So I
correct.
say that in terms of what I would like to see, Tommy. But whether or not it will actually go there, hard to say. Hard to
Yeah,
say.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Looking at the faith and work movement for a long time, it tends to go the way of uh, various different large patrons pushing it one way or another, and then you see stuff pop up. So I've seen that, a few different iterations of that, and I think that actually could be true for the next season of the faith and work movement as well.
Yeah. And Jeff, a lot of times I see on the global scene, you have the folks who are in Indonesia, who are mostly Chinese Indonesians, who have been educated in the US and now coming back to that. For us, a lot of times, yeah, we'll talk about work, but more so, a lot of times we're talking about humility. All their life, they've always had people who have said yes to them. They have nannies, they have helpers. What does it mean when God continues to humble you? What does it mean to serve your employees? Versus in Nairobi, a lot of times we're dealing with individuals who feel like the higher calling is to be a pastor and ministry leaders. And one day, my job as a doctor, lawyer is temporary because I need to pursue the higher calling. And now, how do you bring everyone in the room and have those dialogue and conversations?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think I'm excited for the next 100 years for the global South to lead the West in many ways. So, and I think cultural context is a big one. Thinking about our own cultural context or my own in the United States, a lot of questions around how to engage culture as a Christian were very driving, and now it just feels harder, just harder and harder to answer those in a way that's winsome in the public square. Even this last election, I have never, I can't remember an election in which there was less focus on faith.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
no faith leader's endorsement meant anything,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so there is, I feel like, somewhat of an exile time for people of faith of saying, be faithful. And that's actually, I think, a good thing for the faith at work movement, because, of course, that's vocation. You listen to God's voice and you respond to where you're at. I think that's really important, be faithful. I also think, too, of gosh, to contrast the Nairobi context, if the highest calling is a pastor in Nairobi, I think it's probably to be an entrepreneur, be maybe a big tech entrepreneur in the United States. That's probably the highest or the biggest way you can make an impact. And I think we need a generation of people that are doing that. Entrepreneurship is very important. I care a lot about it, but I also think we need, the presence of the gospel in all these different industries, not only the powerful and the high profile types of industries.
Yeah. Jeff, I think a lot of times we talked about it looks like Andy Crouch's influenced your thinking, the Tim Kellers of the world and all that stuff. But even in your life, as you look back, who influenced some of your thinking in terms of was there your father or pastor or somebody who helped you continue to develop some of these thoughts and ideas?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is actually one of my former coworkers. His name is Brian Gray. He still works at Denver Institute. By the way, I've moved on. I haven't been at Denver Institute for the past couple of years. Um, but I worked with Brian for years, and my shift actually from sort of the Tim Keller, Andy Crouch sort of world in terms of just cultural engagement. Um, my shift was largely influenced by Brian, and Brian really helped me to understand the importance of spiritual formation and really the Ignatian tradition, and us really grasping on tightly to Christ and loosely to everything else. So I think there's maybe a lot we could talk about there, but a handful of coworkers, then a handful of authors like Jacques Philippe's Interior Freedom and others have really made me think about what is faith and work. And
Hmm.
even in my own journey, I felt like societal influence was like grasping smoke. At what point, to quote Colette from Ecclesiastes, like at what point have I influenced society? I'm not quite sure. However, when I lost my temper with my daughters that I talked about, or when I felt utterly exhausted, or I got, felt envy that somebody else is getting to invite to the big gathering and I didn't, those interior things for me started to become the real thing, because I realized that it was my interior world that was influencing my organization, and my organization was influencing other people and my community, but it was actually all had an interior root. Whether or not I was positively influencing others, or I could actually negatively influence the others if I responded very emotionally or harsh to a comment that somebody made. So my shift was a handful of authors, it was a coworker, and then my very gracious wife as well, in terms of, yeah, the first things first is actually an interior conversation before it's about work or culture.
Yeah. Jeff, I love talking with you. And even now, as we're having this conversation for an entire Resource Global family, this actually helps us as we're going into even our own strategic plan. When we first started, it was, hey, how do we help these young marketplace leaders in Jakarta integrate their faith in work and change their city? But in the last 10 years, we've had to ask ourselves, how do we develop these guys spiritually? How do we come alongside and help them grow internally? That's actually more than just the faith and work. So how do we describe it? Is it a new iteration? Is it something different? We're wrestling with the same thing. So thank you for just helping me process through some of those things.
Yeah, and I think it is the same conversation, because one life lived before God is always the message, right? It is a complete vision of redemption. I just think the real sticky ones are not about shifting problems in the world. The real sticky ones are shifting problems inside of me. Like
Yeah,
that's the real that's
yeah.
the real tough one. And even for marketplace leaders, like building a business, in your community, there's stress, there's failure, there's anxiety, there's issues of identity, there's all of these things that are very tough. And if we're going to do faith formation in those contexts, we actually have to do interior work before we think about, okay, what does faith look like applied to culture, to different products, to services, and then to the ways we positively influence our communities. And so I do think they're part of a single whole, of
Yeah.
a sort of inside out journey. But I don't think it's outside in. I don't think it's principally like go out and have an impact, and then we'll figure out the interior stuff later.
Mm.
That usually causes problems when I've
Yeah,
seen it
yeah,
in my
yeah.
own life.
With your book, I mean, Working from the Inside Out, a brief guide to inner work that transforms our outer world. I mean, what talk to me how this book came about. Has it been just things that you've been wrestling with, all of those things, or how did this book come about?
Yeah, so it came from my own journey of leading Denver Institute and paying attention to people. What does faith and work mean? And so the essence of the book is this is what I think it is. I think it's this inside out journey. And so for how I structured the main chapters was the interior world was first sort of seek deep spiritual health and then think theologically. These are interior questions of the habits of thought in our own interior world and our spiritual and emotional health. The second movement is exterior, embrace relationships, and create good work. So that is both how do we interact with others, coworkers, boss, employees? How do we interact with others? How do we build healthy cultures? And then what does it mean for us to create good products and services that our community needs? And then the last one was actually about caring for our community. And I just used
Yeah.
language rather than cultural renewal. I use language of serving others sacrificially, because I think the best way for Christians to engage their community is not with the sword, but with the cross. It is ways of humbly serving and loving, even at cost to self for the benefit of others. So that's what I wrote about. Wrote stories from people I know, some of my own stories. Some of my own stories are mostly of my failures in the book, but wanted to really understand myself. What do I mean by faith and work, and what does it look like for us to change?
Yeah. You open the book with the story about Brent and Amy as a prelude and all that. Can you share a little bit about their story and how that helped you with your thinking?
Sure. Yeah. Early in their story, there's some friends, and I was listening. I always pay attention to what motivates people.
Mhm.
They had gotten married early and had some very severe disappointments in work earlier in their life because of actually a failure of a ministry leader in their life. And when that happened, that very much shifted their sort of motive for kind of impact away from work and into other things. And that shifted my thinking in terms of what is really there, what's really driving people and their interior issues. If, for instance, you really trust a leader and they really fail you, you feel what? Betrayed, frustrated, maybe disillusioned. And these are things that have to be dealt with in our heart in order to kind of move forward. And that just made that clear. So they were very kind for an opening story. By the way, that's not the real name. I did change their names in the book. Every other name was accurate. But that is something that I thought was important for us to pay attention to, is when we're honest, what is really motivating us?
Yeah. It reminds me of a conversation, Jeff, that I was talking with this young individual over in Indonesia, and this individual says, "Man, Tommy, I just want to go and do." But the part that she was struggling with is just her inner anxiety, inner anger, inner frustration on all of those things. And I realized she had to come to grips with reflecting upon her own journey. Jeff, it's literally something my seminary professor encouraged me to do. He says, "Tommy, you're always driving. You have a huge drive, but you don't know how to reflect. You're not being able to see what God is doing in your life." It wasn't until my cancer journey that I forced myself to reflect about what was driving me in everything that I was doing.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. Sometimes we have to slow down. It sounds like that was a severe grace for you in your journey.
Oh, Jeff, I mean, and a lot of times I get bored easily. I can't sit still. I sometimes struggle with feeling guilty if I'm not working. And it wasn't until I dealt with my cancer. And so for about 10 weeks, I lived in constant pain. I had a tumor, a 4 centimeter tumor in my sinus, in 10 weeks of chemo and radiation. And it was like, "Tommy, I'm going to force you to sit down and reflect, because I've tried to tell you and warn you in so many ways. Now I'm going to force you to do it."
Hmm.
But it was those 10 weeks that forced me to reevaluate. So why am I so motivated? What am I drawing? What am I trying to do with myself? Who am I trying to prove?
Hmm.
And I had to come face to face with some of my insecurities to
Hmm.
figure out what was driving me.
Yeah, how did you answer those questions?
I think a lot of times, Jeff, it really was embedded in a lot of my childhood, whether
Hmm.
it's, I just never felt like I was good enough. I was always messed around with. People will always tell me that I just wasn't good enough. I grew so angry with everything that I had to deal with. And it was always driven by the fact to prove people wrong.
Hmm. Yeah, I
And
can
once I
identify with
let
that.
go of that, I had to process through that.
Yeah, I felt a lot of the same things, and with entrepreneurs that I've had a chance to live alongside of. Very common.
Yeah, yeah.
Very common. We're trying to work out our identity and our insecurities with performance.
Yeah. And Jeff, as people are sitting there listening to you, I mean, you talk about your failures. It, how do you get out of that rut? How do you really change? Is it merely changing your perspective? Is it merely just praying to God and asking Him for open doors? Is it a mentor? How do you get yourself out of that rut then?
Yeah, I think a handful of things. I could share some in my experience, and then some I think for other people's experience. My experience was I first had to be able to name what I was feeling before I could do much. And so naming my emotions was a real journey for me. I very much lived in my hands and in my head. I went from idea to go build something, but I didn't actually know what I was feeling or even why I was motivated to do different things. So I think first, naming what I was feeling, whether it was a terrible day or a good day. And then second, I would say for me, it was not trying to change those things, but just being curious. And that curiosity for me is just, why did I do that? What was
Mm,
motivating me? What's happening here? And sitting with that, and I would offer it to my wife, saying, "Why do you think I did that?" To my kids sometimes, to friends, and offer it to God in prayer of why am I doing these different things? What's really motivating? And for me, it was just, and it still is, it's a slow journey of naming my emotions, being curious, and then being in a vulnerable community. I talked in the book about one chapter I talked about how to change, and I do think a high trust community where you can be vulnerable is a
yeah.
very, very important
Yes.
thing. And that
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
be friends, it could be in your church, it could be in your family, but a place where you'll really be real. Because I think we've all been in groups where we kind of know the right thing to say, but people aren't being terribly vulnerable about what they're really. I just think when you choose to do that, that's the right recipe for the beginning of change and allowing the spirit to work inside us.
Yeah. Jeff, one of the things that is you talked about community, I had to learn about doing that. As I struggled and dug myself a deeper and deeper hole, I found my safeguard in ministry. That was a place where people would say great things about me. That was a place where I could get reaffirmed for everything that I was doing. And
Yes.
I realized, wow, I'm really serving just to meet my needs. And I remember it was at that point in time, I was thinking I had grown up in the local church back home, and I sat down with the elders. And Jeff, I sat there with our elders and I said, "Hey, look, I need your help. I want to stay here long term, but I need you to hold me accountable. This is what I'm struggling with. Jeff, where I struggle with is that group of elders said to me, Tommy, you have heart issues that we believe disqualify you from ministry.
Wow.
And so not only are we not going to hold you
Mm.
accountable, we believe that you're not qualified for ministry. You don't have an internship, nor do you have a future with this church. Jeff, and that was the importance of community. I was so open and vulnerable. I grew to be so angry and angry and angry. The next week I was sitting there. Now it was at that time I served our college ministry for 11 years. Jeff, I sat there, opened the bulletin, and on the bulletin it says Tommy Lee has decided to step away from the college ministry. And that was news to me because I guess you guys fired me. And I was hurt by that vulnerable in terms of community. And I had to rebuild my life by finding certain community who allowed me to be open with who I was.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry for your pain. That sounds very, very difficult. And I think, yeah, I've experienced some of that, but that sounds particularly difficult. And even the surprise you had there
Yeah.
at church. Yeah.
And so for you, what was the tough? How has your perspective changed even as you were writing the book and all this stuff? What would you say now to young Christian marketplace leaders, those who are listening from maybe Jakarta or Nairobi or LA or Austin, now compared to what you have said to them 12 years ago when you started in 2012?
Yeah. I think when I was starting, I would have said, you have a great opportunity in your work to make a big impact in your community because God is redeeming the world. Now, I still believe that. I just think it's secondary or tertiary. I would now say the opportunity is for God to impact you and
Mm.
actually to shift and change your own motivation and your own heart desires for why you're doing what you're doing. So I think now I would say, look, it's great to have a big business. It's great to influence your community. Those are important, but the heart can easily grasp onto those things as ultimate, or I need those to be okay. But the finished work of Christ means I am complete. I have all the riches and the notoriety I need right now because I am God's son. It
Yeah.
is actually that resting in the gospel and doing that for real rather than that's the right Christian thing to say. I would say that that's the real journey, is to say, and the test of that is, can you be okay when it goes well? And can you be okay when everything falls apart?
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
be okay when people praise you? And can you be okay when you are slighted,
Yeah.
right? Or can you be okay in those situations? And if you can, that's a good sign that there is an interior core of the Spirit's life living in you that, as Jesus says, can bear good fruit, but you'll know a tree by its fruit. So I just think that it is first that interior journey of us walking in the light of the gospel as well as in the power of the Spirit.
Would you still label it faith and work, or would you call it something different these days, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I don't use that language as much. I think it's still good and important. Definitely, I agree with David Miller. It's a social movement, but I would say I wouldn't even maybe use the language of whole life discipleship, though I like the language of whole life discipleship. Um, I just think language of who are we becoming, language of why are we doing what we're doing, language of what is our desires and what is our motives for
Mhm.
our life, and getting to those, I think, are really, really important. So I do use some language of spiritual formation, even though that tends to put you in sort of a category of, oh, just those people over there think about that sort of navel gazing stuff. Maybe that's not, maybe that's not really fair,
Yeah.
right? But I do think that can put you in that. But at the end of the day, like, who are you really? Like, that's it. Just like, who are you really? Why are you really doing that? Who are
Yeah.
you really in this context? Will you allow God inside your life, right? So if we're
Yeah.
going to be the hands and feet in Jesus of in the world, then he must live in us. He must do his work through us. It must be Christ in us, right? And not just ourselves. And so that I stumbled a little around because I use different language based on what I think somebody needs to hear in the moment to take a deeper journey.
Yeah. Jeff, even as you talk about this, I think about Isaiah, where literally God says, who am I going to send? And Isaiah says, send me. And God literally tells him, hey, look, when I send you and you're going to start preaching to all these people, you're not going to see any results. And he says to him, so how long is this going to happen? Until a tenth remain. So no matter what you do, you will not achieve any results.
Yeah.
So I think of Isaiah, or I think of a mom who has two kids, her husband that left her. She has two or three kids. She has to work. She hates her job. Her boss is just unbearable to deal with. And she can't rest or do anything because she has kids to take care of. How does God redeem? How does God work with you during this time? What is God doing in your life? Those are two stories I think of as I'm hearing you talk.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, as you say that, I think about the Beatitudes. God isn't saying when you're really powerful, everything's are going, then you're blessed, right? It's actually when you're poor or when you're at the end of your rope, right? Or when you need somebody to embrace you, right? Like these are the times actually when God's spirit and his kingdom come. And so if I do think that I wrote about this in one of my articles a while back in God of the Second Shift, I do think there is a somewhat uncomfortable relationship that faith and work movement has with power. Because when you see Jesus, like he gives up his power. All of heaven and earth were his, and he lays it down, the kenosis, the self-emptying of God in Philippians 2. So I do think actually emptying ourselves of sort of our pride and our power is where we tend to experience the kingdom. But then oftentimes in our Christian circles, we'll say, well, who's either making the most money, though we oftentimes don't really clap for that, but we do clap for who is having the biggest kingdom impact. Like I've heard that a lot, right? And is impact our community good? Yes. But if you grasp your heart onto, I need that to be okay, then it can quickly get distorted again. So yeah, I do think it's the little things. You can live out a beautiful life before God, even if everything is going wrong.
Yeah. Jeff, what are you up to now these days?
So I'm building a handful of projects at once. Yep. I was still in touch with the folks at Denver Institute, but I'm doing a project for a university. I'm working in a small business, helping to build a small distribution company. I am working with my church, helping to build a program for Anglican pastors. So the short answer is entrepreneurship. I like building new things. It's what I'm good at. And I just have a few different irons in the fire.
Yeah. Do you see yourself having different irons in the fire? Do you see yourself pursuing that route? Or do you say, man, Tommy, one day I hope to go back and do one organization? Which part do you want to do?
For now, as I think about my 40s, probably a few irons in the fire.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there were some things that I was great at with leading one organization, and then there's other ways that I think I drove everybody crazy.
Yeah.
Too many ideas, moving too quickly, exhaust my coworkers, and unintentionally I just would do that. So I do think this is a little bit of a better structure from where I'm at now. And having said that, if the Spirit leads and says, take hold of that organization for this purpose, for this time, I would do it. I would do it.
Yeah. And hey, look, I think you and I are similar in our journey or age is I love doing multiple things, but I also realize a lot of times as Resource Global grows to 13 different cities, I'm going to have to travel more because I have two young girls. I better be at home once I travel and not be involved in all these other projects.
Yes. Yeah. And most of mine doesn't require too much travel. At least I only got about 5-6 years until I'm an empty nester. So when that happens, I think I'll hop on planes more. But right now I'm going to stay a little closer to home.
Yeah.
A
Jeff,
lot of soccer games to go to.
I really enjoyed talking with you. You made me think about a lot of different things. And so, hey, where can people find you? Are you on social media very much on LinkedIn, Instagram, all of that?
Yeah, you could have Jeff Haanen at LinkedIn. I don't post a ton, but occasionally. And then a couple of websites. One is just Jeff Haanen, so it's Haanen. JeffHaanen.com is my personal writing website. And then I have JeffHaanen.io, which is some of the work that I'm doing now, sort of my contract work. So a couple places you can find me.
Very good. Thank you so much for making some time, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll talk soon.